Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart. Let's paint a War of the Rohirrim Hill Tribesman. Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Baron of Dice, premium wargaming dice. Over 500 styles, over 4,000 customer reviews. Welcome to the best dice on the planet. So the War of the Rohirrim is here in cinemas soon. Depending when you're watching this, it may already be out. And on pre-order from Games Workshop, the new edition, the new starter set. And what a starter set it is as well. For the first time in a very long time, I think, since the Warpaint release, we have all brand new miniatures and multi-part sculpts for the Rohan warriors and the new Hill Tribesmen. And if you haven't already seen them or seen videos like them, you might want to check out my review of the box and then a longer podcast chat I had with my friend Dan called The Hobby Hour, where we really delve into our thoughts and feelings on the box. I'll pop links into the show now. Now, in my third video related to this release, I'm tackling a tutorial for painting one of the new Hill Tribesmen. I do a lot of painting tutorials on the channel. That's probably 50% of what I do. So hopefully you enjoy this and maybe find some tips to take away. So I'm starting with a black primed miniature here. I tend to start with black. I use a lot of Zenithal highlighting with an airbrush. And I'm starting with Death Reaper and Dungeon Stone Grey from the Two Thin Coats range. I've deliberately chosen Two Thin Coats paints here because I know they convert very well to Citadel colours. So you'll be looking at Corvus Black and Mechanicus Standard Grey as the kind of the closest representations of those colours. Now here what I'm doing is I'm using my airbrush to do a subtle build up from black to a darkish grey, almost Zenithal style. If you don't have an airbrush, you can either skip this stage completely or you can build these up with really light dry brushing stages. Deliberately, by focusing top down on these stages, it's leaving all of that black in the undercuts and the shadows. So we're basically building up a really good layer for our black colour, so we've got less work to do later on. Now this next stage is a little bit different. I'm using some white here. This is a Two Thin Coats white. You can use any white really. I definitely recommend these ones, and a dry brush. This is from Knott's Hobbies. It's quite a beaten up one now, and a texture palette of which to rub the paint off on. Now this is very similar to what people might have heard called slap chop, but because I've done the previous Zenithal style layers building up with that grey, I'm actually trying to be a little bit more careful here rather than just giving a really heavy dry brush all over in order to sort of use contrast paints and things after, which I will be using some of. I want to maintain some of that work we've done with the airbrush, building up that nice shadow from black through to grey on the black clothing. There's lots of black clothing on this miniature. So I'm trying to tickle this a little bit here and really just pick out some of the detail. Things like the hair around the sort of straps on their wrists and on the feet, on some of the areas of clothing, especially the fur areas, but not the flatter black areas. And what you should be able to see here is a greyish looking miniature that the flatter areas of clothing don't have that horrible dry mark you get from heavy dry brushing. Really am just picking out the edges here. So we want to make use of those edges that we've picked out while also making use of the dry brushing, and just being that little bit subtle with it, a little bit gentle with it is definitely a way of achieving it. Now we are moving on to some contrast. This is Cygor Brown and Garagax Sewer, and they're going to be the base layers for the two browns in this recipe. Now the Hill Tribesmen in the studio paint job, and I'm guessing in the film as well, which I haven't seen at the time of this, are very dark looking, almost really dim, grim layers of black and brown. So I don't want it to be too bright, and that's why I've gone with these colours, and why I've gone with a black base for this miniature. And by using these colours, I know I've got some paints that are perfect for highlighting on top afterwards. Though if you want to keep your paint job simple and just use your contrast style layers on the top like this and make use of that little bit of mini slap chop we got going on, the miniature will look really good as a tabletop standard as well. I guess if you're painting a whole unit of these, you can mix and match a little bit of what areas are going to be black, which areas are going to be which brown as well, just to give them a little bit of variation. After all, they're not wearing a uniform, are they? They're wearing sort of scraggy clothes, things that maybe not looked after quite as well. It's worth having a little idea before you fly into sticking your brown on, making sure that maybe one brown doesn't overlap too much with another, so you can sort of zone the colours and make them really stand out. And here is the Garagak sewer, which I'm using on the fur areas and just a little bit over the shoulder as well. It's that slightly lighter brown just to give that little bit of variation. It doesn't show up an awful lot yet, but when we highlight it a little bit later on, it really pops. This is contrast basilicanium grey, and I'm just going to glaze now over a lot of the areas that I want to be black, where the dry brushing has picked out little bits of detail, but it looks a little bit bright. And this is just a super easy, quick way, cheating way of doing black. Now, I wouldn't do it on the flatter areas quite as much unless it was too bright and I wanted to glaze it down, but it's a really handy way of building up your black through to grey with your airbrush, or dry brushing if you don't have an airbrush, and then doing this subtle kind of white slap chalk-esque dry brush over the top, and you can just really tone it back down just by doing a thin glaze like this. Now you could use black, but it might tone it down a little bit too much, so I'm using the grey here, and I think that works really well with the kind of the transitions that I've already got going on in the colours on the miniature. And then you can see I'm actually using it on the hair as well. It will just tone down some of those brightest areas of dry brushing, and it will go back in a little bit later on when this is dry and actually use some grey to highlight more traditionally. Even adding a little bit onto the boots there. I could have gone for a darker colour, but I'll be using some pigments and things later on, so they won't actually need that much detail painted in. Now, there's very little metallic areas on the miniature. I'm using Two Thin Coats Dwarven Iron. Iron Warrior will be a perfect colour if you're using the Citadel range, and it's just painting in the sword here all over, hilt and pommel as well. It's not a very posh weapon, so I'm not going to be adding any sort of gold filigree or anything like that, and this is just a nice dull gunmetal iron kind of colour to base on. So this is Barbarian Brawn, Dwarven Skin and Elven Skin from the Two Thin Coats range. So their Citadel conversions are Bugman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh, or at least close enough. And we're just starting with basic layering here. So standard layering style of painting, which you'll have learned if you follow the Citadel style of painting. Very normal. You could use contrast paints and things for this as well if you wanted to, but over a black base coat like this, you'll struggle a little bit. So just a nice, neat, even coat all over the fleshy areas. And on this miniature, you're talking about the face. Much of it's hidden by all the hair as well, and then just both hands. And then we just build up with the next layers. So in this case we have the Dwarven Skin, and each time we're leaving a little bit of the previous shade showing, so keep it in the recesses. So you're just focusing on those higher areas, so the cheekbones, the nose, the forehead, before moving on to the Elven Skin tone. And again, same thing, cheekbones, nose, forehead, knuckles, fingers, that kind of thing, but again slightly less than you have before, leaving both of those previous tones showing through as well. And this is Citadel Contrast Shyish Purple, adding a little bit to my wet palette with a little touch of water, probably 2 parts paint to 1 part water. And then I'm just adding it where the cuff is on the hand there, and then just wet blending out towards the knuckles, and it just adds a little bit of extra tone there, warms it up slightly, adds a little bit of coolness as well, if that makes sense, into the shadow area, and it just looks great. You can put it in the eye sockets and things as well. Now I've grabbed Doom Death Black and Ivory Tusk here, but you can use any black and white really. It's better for eyes to use something that's not bright white, otherwise they stand out a little bit too much. But I like to do my eyes now, so that if I mess them up, I can go back and touch them up with the flesh tone while I still have them in my palette. If you're looking for a quick tabletop miniature, you could stop there without doing any further highlights, and it looks great. But we're moving on, and this is Gizmo Fur from the Two Thin Coats range. So you're looking at something like XV88 from the Citadel range, and I'm just using it very subtly. I've thinned it 50-50 with water on my wet palette, and I'm just picking out the top edges of the fur and of those little bits on the shoulder, which was that lighter brown. There's already a little bit of transition there anyway, because we've underpainted with that little bit of dry brushing. So that base layer of Garagak Sewer, which is what this is going over, already had a sort of subtle tonal change to it and a little bit of a highlight built in. So really you're just accentuating that top highlight already with this thin layer of Gizmo Fur or XV88, whichever you're using. This is Cerebus Brown, or Ungor Flesh if you're using the Citadel range. I'm just using it for an extra top highlight on the ends of some of the strands of fur, and if I really wanted to, I could put them on the areas or on the shoulder as well. Depends how much you want that highlight to pop, and whether you want to make it a little bit brighter than the box art, I suppose. This is Dungeonstone Grey, of course, from the Two Thin Coats range. Like pretty much everything else, there's not a contrast paint in this tutorial. Mechanicus Standard Grey, I believe, is the closest match. Now, remember, we built up layers of grey with the airbrush, and because we did it top down, there is already a change in the undercuts compared to what's on the top areas, and it's hard to see on camera sometimes, but there's already like a highlight layer built in. So what I'm doing here with this grey, with the paint again thinned about 50-50 on my wet palette, is just very gently going in and accentuating to start with those highlights, those areas where the light is hitting the most, and it really just kind of makes it pop and stands out a little bit more. So gentle thin lines, thin line highlighting, very, very standard stuff, things I'm sure you've seen before, but it just makes it a lot easier. You're not having to do multiple layers of this because you've done so much work with the airbrush, if you use the airbrush, that is. Again, if you did the dry brushing stage earlier on, as long as they were soft enough dry brushing layers, you will still get a very similar effect at this stage. This is Wizard Grey. If you're using Citadel, you're looking at something like Dawnstone. Again, this is just a further layer of highlight should you wish to. Slightly thinner lines, really accentuating those top areas where the light is hitting. And it's really up to you whether you do this stage, how bright you'll want your top highlights to be on the black. This obviously makes it look slightly more grey, but I think the end effect, once you finish painting everything, your eye makes you think it's black anyway, and essentially what you're doing with black anyway is working with loads of different shades of grey anyway. So up to you how far you want to take it. I just wanted to make it pop and stand out a little bit more. This is Carl Charadon Grey, which would be Administratum Grey, I think, from Citadel. And all three of these greys are actually in a triad. The triad system from Two Thin Coats is really, really good because they work well together. But instead of putting it on the clothing here and adding an even brighter highlight, I don't want to do that. But I am using it to highlight just the hair, really. So we've got this massive beard and moustaches and the hair. And I'm just using the side of my bristles a little bit here just to make it a little bit easier. So this is Cuirass Leather and Boar Hide. If you're using Citadel paints, you'll be looking at something like Rhinox Hide and Doombull Brown. And again, now we're just working on another area of the miniature, and we're working up that darker brown, the one that was base coated with the Cygor contrast brown, not the Garagak Sewer brown, which we've already done. Basic layering again, focusing on those top areas of the folds in the clothing, which are already looking slightly lighter because we dry brushed a tiny bit first. We did that semi-zenithal with greys with the airbrush, and when we placed that contrast paint, almost glazed because it was a fairly thin coat over it, you could just see subtle highlights already built in. So we're just, with these slightly thinner paints on the wet palette, reinforcing those highlighted areas so that it doesn't look too bright and garish, so it blends into that base colour. And these paints just work really well with those contrast colours as a base coat, really. And we work through both colours, adding thinner lines each time until we're happy with it. You can see when we start adding that boar hide, it's almost got a reddish finish to it, but when it dries, it dulls down quite a lot. So don't panic when you first apply and think, whoa, this is a little bit too red. It's not at all, and by the time it's dried, it gives a really nice effect. So this is Game Air Silver. Yes, it's not a Two Thin Coats paint, so I've broken my rules slightly there. If you want to use Citadel or something like Stormhost Silver would be the most similar. This is a great paint. It goes through the airbrush fantastically. It's an air paint with a little bit of thinner there, but it's also brilliant with the hairy brush, and it's just my go-to top highlight for silver every time. Thins really nicely with a little bit of water. You can feather it out and it doesn't break down and break up like some metallic paints do, and it's just really, really good, and you can blend it easily all the time. I just love it. So I definitely recommend picking up a pot and using it for things like this if you haven't already tried it. So this is a ready mixed oil wash called Grease from Scale 75. I'm using this in lieu of something like an Angorok Third Shade. I love oil paints. Using an old brush for it, but I'm putting this straight onto the metallic paints. It's actually fine. Just kind of shadowing the bottom of the blade there. The good stuff with oil paints is that you can buff them around and wipe them back off afterwards. If you have pooling with a standard wash, you have to go back and paint over the top of this. This we won't need to do. This is a really easy to kind of play around with afterwards. And I'm also using it on my basing as well. I've got a little bit of basting texture on there, and I'm just putting this straight over the top afterwards. And when it dries this really nice kind of matte effect as well. But oil paints just take that a little bit longer to dry. And the other thing which you want to use if you are going to go down the oil paint route is something like this. This is an AK thinner. It's an odorless thinner. It's an artist thinner. You don't want to be using the stuff from B&Q. Just a little bit of clean on the airbrush, a bit of paper towel, and any pooling, anything I don't like, I can just wipe this away again, which you obviously can't do with an Agrax Surf shade. And then this is a rust effect from a company called Dirty Down as well. So I'm just adding a little bit around certain areas of the blade, playing around with it. You can build this up with layers. I just figured this blade wouldn't be very well looked after, and I wanted to make it look a bit grim and gritty. I have to wait for the oil paints to fully dry, but I'm actually brushing in some dry pigment here. So towards the end of this miniature, I've definitely veered away from that, and you can use this Citadel paint if you've got it. A lot of these things now aren't things you will find available from Games Workshop, but I thought I'd leave them in the video so people could at least see them. I'm assuming there'll be some people that don't normally follow my tutorials that might not be familiar with them. Just using some 2mm Tufts here as well, just to add a little bit of variation onto the base. And then after that, I'm using a little bit of mud effect. This isn't like the basing texture like Sterling mud. That's already gone on the base, that style of thing. This is more of an effects paint, and just put a couple of little splotches on here and there. Really kind of ties in those tufts to the ground and looks really good. And then I like to finish my bases with a black rim. You obviously use whatever you do for your miniatures normally. I just prefer a black rim. I think it really finishes off the miniature nicely. And there he is, all finished. But let's have a look at some proper pictures. And there he is in all of his glory with some proper pictures. Really fun to paint. Really quite easy to paint while they're very small, because they're 28mm true scale. For those of you who are watching this that are used to my old world videos, they are a little bit thinner and smaller than the normal heroic scale Citadel miniatures. If you're a Middle Earth player, you'll know that already. But they're really well detailed, which makes it easier to paint when the detail is well defined. So I didn't have any issues. And I think painting up a unit or two, or even a whole army of the Hill Tribes was relatively easy if you're using the kind of techniques I have here. If you don't use an airbrush, you can get away with doing some dry brushing and really building those out, and just making use of things like contrast paints and underpainting. You can get quite a nice effect very quickly. Do the faces well, make them stand out, do the metallics well, make them pop, draw your eye to those areas, do some really nice bases, and before you know it, you'll have a stunning looking army on the table for relatively low effort. Hopefully some of the techniques here are scalable, so some people that won't want to do some of the highlights and things like that will see parts of the tutorial. They can take away certain things. And of course there'll be painters that are way better than me that will paint these much better and push their techniques much further. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found something useful. Maybe if you did, please give it a like, drop a comment below. It really helps the video be seen by other people. If you're not already subscribed to the channel, please do so. There will be plenty more Middle-earth strategy battle game content on the channel moving forward. There are a few past videos anyway, and a few very recent ones, an unboxing and review of the new starter set, an extended hobby hour podcast edition with my friend Dan, where we talk about the new release and give our own thoughts in more detail on that new starter set. And very soon there will be a painting tutorial for a Rohan warrior from that set as well. So if you're interested, it's worth subscribing now so you don't miss out on that one. If you'd like to support the channel even further, there's loads of links in the video description to help you do that. There's dry brushes and sponging tools from Knott's Hobbies. There's an affiliate link there at a discount, and also Galeri airbrushes, again a discount available through them as well. There's an affiliate link to Warlord Games if you like your historical miniatures. There's also a link to the channel sponsor Baron of Dice as well, with a discount code to get you 5% off. I have a Patreon, of course there's a link for that as well, multiple tiers, and it's a really good way of supporting me and the channel continue to produce videos like this. There's also a Discord which is completely free to join. But thank you very much for watching, take care, and I'll catch you soon.